I built a gate that's a little over 8 feet wide. It has wire fencing, which reduces the weight compared to picket fence gates, but because the fence doesn't provide any additional stability, it requires extremely sturdy joints. So I used half-lap joints, and I'll show you how to make them with 3 different types of tools. I have another video on building smaller gates with basic joinery that I will link in the description. This fence is built on a slope, but it's at the corner of my yard, so I was able to rotate it roughly 45 degrees until it was level across the hill without restricting the access. The gate is wide enough to drive almost any vehicle through, and I cased the edges of the fence with appearance boards to give it a nice seamless look, and that actually added a few inches of clearance on either side, so technically the gate is 100 inches wide rather than 96. To build this gate, I used a pair of 4x4 inch posts. These are 6 feet long, although in hindsight I should have used 8 feet just for extra stability. I used 2x4s. These are 8 feet long and I used 5 of them. And then these are those 1-inch appearance boards I mentioned, and I used 6 of those. And of course this is all pressure treated lumber. And then finally, welded wire fence, 4 feet tall. For hardware, I used 2 pairs of non-springing hinges. These are black enamel. This is not the latch I used, but it is a good option. I used it on another gate and it worked well. Pair of black enamel handles. I used poultry staples to attach the fence to the frame, and I used 1 1/4 inch wood screws for my half-lap joints. In addition to those wood screws, I also used Titebond 3 exterior wood glue and an applicator. And then finally, this is called a cane bolt. This is what will hold one of the 2 gates in place, immobilized, so that the other one can latch against it. And then in combination with that, I used a PVC pipe, which I sunk into the ground. I made the gate frames 49 inches wide and 46 inches tall, so that's giving me a little bit of extra width right off the bat, but I went a little shorter on the height so that at the bottom it could sweep more easily across the grass and snow, but yet be even with the fence across the top. And by keeping the height at 46, I was able to get both a horizontal and a vertical piece out of every board.
So most lumber is far from perfect no matter where you get it. Case in point, most people know that a 2x4 is not actually 2 inches by 4 inches, it's more like 3.5 by 1.5 inches, and sometimes it's not even 3.5 by 1.5. For example, these 2 boards here are 3.5 wide, a little bit proud, whereas these 2 are closer to 3 5/8. So what that means is when I'm notching these from my joints, I'm going to have 3 5/8 width notch and then a 3.5 inch notch. So what I've gone and done is I've paired up these boards according to consistent width. Going forward, I'm going to do everything in 2 phases. This is going to be door number 1. This is going to be door number 2. And that way, hopefully, I'll have nice pretty joints and they'll be clean looking and they'll fit. These are just scrap pieces, of course, but basically what I've done is notching out about half the width so that these 2 guys can interlock like that. And what that does is it gives me a little bit additional mating surface for me to glue up, and it gives me a bigger surface area to put multiple screws in.
To measure the notches I'm going to cut in these boards, first I measure the width of the board and mark it there, and then I measure the thickness of the board divided in half and mark it on the side. I also mark it on the end grain so I can adjust the depth of my blade. You can pick up a pull saw for about 25 bucks at most hardware stores. The Japanese models are a little more expensive, but American made is fine for these purposes. The teeth are reversed versus a normal panel saw, and so that makes it a little bit easier to control. The blade is also a little bit thinner for long cuts like this, but it is pretty exhausting. The pros for using a pull saw is it's relatively cheap and you can usually get a nice smooth cut on the first try. The downsides are it does take a decent amount of skill, it can be tiring, and also because the blade is a bit thinner than a typical panel saw, the grain can cause the saw to wander a bit and you won't get a perfectly straight cut no matter how good you are. From the side you can see it's relatively flat across, which is good, But from the end, you can see there's a little bit of cupping just where the grain kind of pulled the blade in the center, and I'll need to take that out with a sanding block. This one is still not perfect, but it's pretty close, and I'm going to move on to the second method, which is using a miter saw. My miter saw has this tab, which I can use as a stop to limit the blade from cutting all the way through the wood, and then this depth gauge, which I can adjust to the appropriate depth. So I have my depth stop set on the saw itself, and then I have a horizontal stop clamped to the fence, and that's set to the width of the board, and that ensures that none of my cuts are going to exceed those limits, and then that means every board I cut will be exactly the same, in theory. And you might notice here that there are still some slight variation in the depth of my cuts. Part of that is my technique. Another part of that is just there's a little bit of flex in my miter saw, so you have to know your equipment. Once I have all those boards cut, I get to go through and knock out all those cuts with, in my case, a chisel. You can use a hammer, you can use a screwdriver. Anything works. It's going to be rough the first time through no matter what, and I'm not going to lie, this part's pretty fun. The slightly more tedious phase of this is going through and cleaning all this up with the chisel, which I will show you in a couple minutes. But first, you can do the same thing using a circular saw, which eliminates the need for a miter saw. If you don't have a miter saw, you can do the same technique using a circular saw. Here I've taken a piece of scrap wood and made a permanent fence, just basically screwing it onto the boards I'm going to cut. And then I take my circular saw and I set the depth of my cut to 3/4 of an inch. I'm using a piece of scrap wood that happens to be 3/4 of an inch just to set up the depth of that cut. And then I run the circular saw through, kind of imitating the same technique as the miter saw, but I'm cutting all 4 boards at one time, so this actually goes a little bit quicker. And my last pass goes right up against that fence. Regardless of which method you choose, you will have to clean up all your cuts after you're done. You can do that using a router, which I'll show you in a second. I kind of like using a chisel. It's a bit tedious and your chisel has to be extremely sharp, but I found it pretty satisfying doing this. There are a number of good chisel sharpening videos out there. I like one by Matt Esley. Here I'm checking the level, and you can see I got it pretty flat across the cut. Still a few notches in it, however, so I'm going to take those out with a palm sander. Even after sanding, I still had a few imperfections, and that's okay as long as there's no major cupping. An alternative to using a chisel is using a router, and here I'm setting my bit to a depth of 3/4 of an inch, and I'm setting a fence that is the distance of the end of my base plate to that bit in the center. Now this method is risky because it relies on your base plate resting on the board above your cut and kind of using that as a stop so you don't go beyond 3/4 of an inch for your depth. And here I've set up another board on the opposite side of my cut to kind of pick up the router on the opposite side, but it's still very dicey, and really what I should have done here is just build a bigger base plate, but I didn't really have time to go into that for this particular video, so I didn't do it, and here you can see all the imperfections that were left as a result. Imperfections are not the end of the world, and they can even give your glue something to grab onto as long as they're minimal. When I'm laying the frames out, I like to put supports under the corners because it takes out any leveling issues with the floor. And if I end up with a little gap like this, it means I cut a little bit too deep, but I just move those supports out to the corner, and then they sit flush. I like to clamp right angle jigs into the corners to make sure the frame is square. These are jigs that I made on my own out of some plywood. You can also buy them. I did not have quite enough clamps for all 4 corners, so in that situation, you can just use duct tape. Just make sure to wrap it all around, get it nice and snug. I pretty much always drill pilot holes before putting a screw through any piece of wood just to prevent it from splitting. And here I'm staggering these pilot holes across the grain so no 2 holes are in line. And that will also help prevent it from splitting. And if you do pilot holes, it's important to do that before your glue up. And here I'm just liberally applying a coat to any surfaces that are going to make contact with each other. I put a coat on both sides to make sure any gaps are filled. Here's an overhead view of a single frame from start to finish, and here you can see all the steps I just walked through. see I'm using 4 screws per joint. I've seen other people use 5. I really don't think it makes much of a difference. Either of those options are going to be super sturdy. And after everything is glued up and clamped, I let the glue cure for at least 24 hours before I put any weight on it or I install it on the posts. For the diagonal braces, I'm putting these in place and then marking where my cuts are going to be, and I'm not looking for any specific angle here, just relatively close to a 45. The more important thing is getting the right length, and we'll do that by making our first cut, and then our second cut will be very generous, and then we'll kind of creep up to the mark. I took great pains here to make sure my saw was perfectly aligned because, like I said, this is not an exact 45-degree angle. Align and then align again, and then make sure you're feeling really confident before you pull that trigger. And now as I'm dry fitting it, you can see it's a little bit too long because I was very conservative with that first cut. So I'm going to go back and take a tiny little sliver out of it again, and we'll just keep creeping up until we get a really nice snug fit. Again, take your time with this one because if that joint is not perfectly snug, the board can't do its job, and it's very difficult to mark it perfectly the first time. So I'm going to attach these diagonal braces with towing in some screws at either end and some glue, and I'm using a 3/8 spade bit here so I can countersink those screw heads before I put them in. My joints ended up overlapping just a little bit, so I flush cut them with a pull saw. To apply the galvanized wire fence, I just clamp it in place in one spot, and then I use these galvanized poultry net staples. I like to hold them in place with a pair of pliers so I don't smash my fingers. I like to apply them wherever 2 pieces of wire cross, and I kind of work from inside to outside of a given board just to help take out any slack. And you'll notice my fence overhangs the gate by about 1 inch or 2 at the bottom, and that's because I left a gap for sweeping across grass and snow. I'm cutting the end of the fence with an angle grinder, and you can also use a hacksaw for this, but regardless, you do need to deal with these cut-off ends because they can get kind of sharp. One way to deal with them is to loop them back on themselves. What I'm doing is I'm facing the entire thing with these 1-inch appearance boards. This is a totally optional step, but I kind of thought it would look nice, and in my opinion, it did. The place where I'm installing this gate is on a slope, so I had to cut across the corner of my yard at a diagonal in order to find a level, and then I dropped an 8-foot board and dug post holes on either side. Experts will tell you to make your post holes at least 30 inches deep to get below the frost line. I did not go 30 inches deep. I only went about 2 feet deep on either side. I did have stability issues down the road, but I don't think it was because of the depth of my holes. I think it was because I didn't use enough concrete. So here you can see my wife and I are backfilling the holes with some rock and clay, and then we're going to dump in a bunch of concrete. I didn't put concrete all the way up to the top of the hole because I wanted to finish it off with grass, and that's my biggest regret. I think I should have gone all the way to the surface with that concrete, and that would have kept these poles from being a little wobbly, as you will see in a second. I expect I'm going to get a lot of comments on this part of the video, and I welcome those comments because there are a lot of different ways to anchor posts into the ground. Better ways than this for sure, including digging a concrete footer and using a bracket at the top. This is what I had time and budget for. If you're doing what I did, you can just pour that Quikrete in there and let the rainwater mix it for you. You do need to allow several days for that concrete to set up. I waited several months before I installed these gates, and you can see I've got spacer strapped to the bottom so I can get 2 to 3 inches off the ground. And then I've got 2 pieces of 1/4-inch ply, and I'm going to put those together and use those as a spacer to install my hinge. Before I attach the hinge, I use a scrap piece of wood just to make sure my gate and my post are flush at top and bottom. The total distance between my 2 fence posts was 102 inches because I thought I was going to case both sides of both gates, but I only ended up doing the insides. So here I'm putting a 2-inch nailer on the right post, and that's going to reduce my total distance between the posts to 100 inches. My gates are 49 inches each, so that means I've got 98 inches of gate with 2 inches of margin. I'll use a 1/2 inch on either side between gate and post, and then a full inch in between the 2 gates in the center. So if you want to make these gates, make them 49 inches wide, set your posts 100 inches apart, then you'll have a 1-inch gap, or in my case 3/4 is what I came out to in the center, and then a 1/2 inch gap on either side. A little margin for error never hurt. Here you can see after the installation my gates were perfectly level and straight. But that was with all the clamps and braces applied. After I took everything off, this happened. Because it was winter and my ground was soft. You can see the flex because I didn't bring my concrete to the top and I didn't sink my posts deep enough. So I remedied the situation with stakes and shims and more stakes and more shims, just to add some stability to the ground. And of course, what happened? I overcorrected. So I corrected again. And in the end, I had about 6 shims and stakes in the ground, but ultimately it was more stable, and after this, it didn't move. Rather than installing that dinky latch I showed you at the beginning, I went back to the store and got this bolt because it's a lot more stable and it allows more margin for error just in case I needed it. At the bottom of the left-hand door, I installed this cane bolt which sinks into the ground, and it was a little tricky to install because it had 3 brackets, so I dry fitted it first so that I could see what the open height would be, and then I installed the top bracket. This is where it will rest when the gates are both open, so that it holds the bolt off the ground. The lower bracket can be installed really anywhere near the bottom of the gate, but before that gets installed permanently, you have to add the middle bracket, which stabilizes the bolt when it's in the closed position. And then finally, I took about a foot-long piece of PVC pipe, I heated up one end, and then I put it in my bench vise and continued to heat it up a little bit, and then put some vice grips on there just to make the end into kind of a point. I let it cool for a couple hours, then I drove it into the ground so the bottom of that cane bolt could rest inside of it rather than just sitting in the dirt. This is another little bonus, but you can see how weathered the tops of these posts get because they're end grain and they're exposed to the weather. So I made these little caps to protect them, and I fitted them on there using some dowels and some dowel centers. I go into more detail on this in my other gate video. I just thought it was a nice way to cap them off and protect them at the same time.
Summer now, the gate is still standing. It's a little bit faded, but that's to be expected. I'll put some stain on there to protect it a little bit further. But a few things have happened in the interim, and I wanted to point those out. First of all, I've had some insects try to burrow holes into some of my posts, and so I've patched those with some wood putty. Another thing that's happened, more importantly, is this post over here has actually bowed just a little bit under the weight of this gate. And the primary reason for that is I don't have any fence rails on this side counterbalancing it, so there's nothing to kind of pull this direction. If you have a fence that you're putting a gate into, unlike just a wire fence with stakes, you'll probably be okay. But if you don't, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some braces just running to the ground on this side to just balance that out and keep it level. That's why this is not perfectly even right here. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't post these videos as soon as I film them. I want to wait a little while and see how everything's going. I'm always learning as I'm doing things, and certainly not an expert, but I appreciate you watching anyway. I hope that you have learned something from this project, that it's helped with your project in some way, and I hope you'll join me on the next video.
We had to determine what size gate we needed. We thought we want to be able to drive a giant boat into the backyard, so we chose a very large style of gate. Then we decided that you gotta stick really strong stuff down in the ground about 100 feet. These go about 100 feet down.
Give or take.
You put these on at the end. First you put these in, but you put these in at the end. In the middle, you do all this. Okay, this can come on at any time. Doesn't really matter because you could open this just with your hand. And then to make it look a little sexier, you can spray this down, but it doesn't look that great. I hope that helps. Leave a note in the comments about how this video helped you.
And we're done.
That's it.